Hello and welcome to episode 55 and 56, Beyond Conventional, Emerging Threats and the Future of War. To have a deeper look at this topic, we have today with us Dr. Sean McFate. Hi, Sean. Welcome to the podcast.
Thank you for having me on.
Thank you very much, Sean. I have been reading your post articles and I've seen like several of your books published as well. So I was very much curious to have an individual like you, an expert, I would say, like you on the podcast because I had several experts, from the think tanks, from several of the government institutions, but there were hardly any expert who have written like a series of books, I would say, on certain topics in the national security domain, in the terrorism and the intelligence side. So yeah, thank you very much. I'm really excited to have this conversation. So yeah, but before we take a deeper look into the topic, can you briefly tell us about yourself, your academic background, and your research experience, and how you ended up being who you are as at the moment?
Sure. I've had sort of a hopscotch career. My name is Dr. Sean McFate. I'm a professor of international security studies and really war at the National Defense University in Washington, D.C., which is the U.S.'s premier war college, at Georgetown University's Foreign Service School, and at Syracuse University's Maxwell School. I've also worked for several think tanks like RAND and the Atlantic Council. But before any of this, I was an officer in the U.S. Army's 82nd Airborne Division, their sort of elite paratrooper unit. And then after that, I got out and I hopped the fence, as they say, to the dark side, and I became a private military contractor globally. And, some would say that's a euphemism for a mercenary. But I was doing all sorts of stuff around the world, not just Iraq or Afghanistan. And that taught me to see the world and warfare and strategy in a very different light, in ways you can't learn about modern warfare in libraries alone. So my sort of mission since then, since I got out of that, was to sort of reveal this world. And I've written a lot of serious nonfiction about this. Also, I've written novels. I'm a novelist, trying to tell that story through novels. I advise gaming companies, I advise Hollywood, and I advise the Pentagon.
Interesting. I think that's a very exciting, I would say, journey. But I'm pretty sure there have been like several challenges that you might have faced for sure. Because reaching this position, accepting the challenges, especially when you're on field, and converting those challenges into an opportunity is, it feels very nice to hear the stories, but the person like you who is on ground knows the actual fact of what you go through, complete, of course, the mental pressure, the physical demanding things as well. So
Yeah.
yeah, I'm pretty sure we'll be discussing most of these things in the further part of the conversation as well.
Yes. Yes, we will. Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm not gonna paint it over. It was all easy and meant to be. I think young people, when they start, they have two paths. They can take the path well trodden, and they could achieve some success in that, whether you're a lawyer or a government official or a military officer, or you can try to create a self-invented path. And that's hard. And you never really get positive feedback because you look weird to everybody. But I would say that to young people out there, it means the first half of your career will be very hard, but the second half will be much easier because you'll see things nobody else can see, and you can do things nobody else can possibly dream of.
Yes, definitely yes. And just to, I mean, take a deep dive and little bit broaden the horizon on the conversation that we just had. We have a very broad range of audience on the podcast, and that's the reason I always keep to start it with, I would say, basic questions. Basically, as we are discussing about war, you mentioned about Iraq as well. So as we have this, wide spectrum of audience, so can you please tell us what is the difference between regular and irregular warfare?
Yes, it's a great question. Um, Regular warfare, irregular warfare, it has many names: conventional warfare, unconventional warfare, symmetrical warfare, unsymmetrical or asymmetrical. So when you think about, you ask people what is war, they usually think about like World War II or World War One, and that's what we call regular warfare. It's state on state, only state on state, and they're fought with through industrial strength militaries that nominally obey the laws of war, that wear uniforms, that don't attack civilians, et cetera. And you see, and it's really about brute force, and it's about big battles and how big battles win the war. So think of like Stalingrad, that was the point upon which the Soviet Union really defeated Nazi Germany. It's not the day that warfare ended, but it's the day that the war was won. Same with the Battle of Midway in World War II, where the tide of war turned against the Japanese and for the Americans and their allies. So this is conventional warfare. Think of World War II movies. Now, unconventional warfare is everything else. It doesn't look like that. So
Yes.
think of what Israel is doing in Hamas. Think about Al Qaeda. Think about wars against terrorists. Think about wars against narcos. Think about non-state actors and sort of like wars in Africa that nobody quite understands. And so but we think of war as looking like World War II. That's the way it ought to look. But if you look at wars since World War II, only 6% are conventional. That means 94% of all wars since 1945 have been unconventional. Yet the way that
Yes.
NATO wants to fight, for example, is conventionally. And one of my jobs I find is to challenge that. Are we sure this is the future of war? Because it costs a lot of money.
Yes, definitely. And yeah, I think on the same lines itself, how do you see the role of traditional military alliances, as you mentioned, especially about NATO, evolving in the face of emerging threats? Because I believe emerging threats are something, very much hybrid in nature, as several
Yeah.
non-state actors are also involved in it.
So warfare evolves. So one to answer the question about like NATO, there's a saying that generals always fight the last war they won. And NATO is stuck with this problem. They're still fighting. How do we win World War II with better technology? So they're investing heavily in conventional militaries, tanks, F-35s, aircraft carriers. Meanwhile, warfare has moved on, but NATO has not. The US has not. Warfare is now involves things like non-attributional forces, like special operations forces, mercenaries, terrorist organizations, narco organizations. And some states like Russia have evolved with it. So if you look at the war in Ukraine right now, people think of this as a conventional war. Why do they think that? Well, it's fought by two militaries that generally wear uniforms, not always. Russia, Ukraine, it's interstate. They see tanks, artilleries, they see front lines, they see trenches. It reminds them of conventional wars like Stalingrad, the Battle of Verdun, the Battle of the Somme in World War One. And it has some aspects of that, but those are really not the most important aspects of the war in Ukraine. After the spring and summer and now fall offensive, which Ukraine launched against Russia, which was purely conventional, it was a total failure.
Yes.
They achieved nothing. They didn't achieve any new significant territory. All this money, all these lives, everything was poured into it. And now NATO doesn't want to give money anymore to Ukraine as a result. They're like, you wasted it all. Of course, the US was pushing them to do these silly tactics, but we'll get back to that if you wish. But if you look at the unconventional aspects of the war, they have been determinative. So in February of 2022, we all remember how Russia did a blitzkrieg into Ukraine, and everybody, including Moscow and NATO, thought Kiev would fall in 3 days. And it didn't happen. Kiev, the Ukrainians fought back using guerrilla warfare, unconventional warfare, anti-tank missiles and guerrilla units, and totally pushed back the blitzkrieg. After 4 weeks of failure, Putin changed his strategy from conventional war to Russian unconventional war. And what that means is, and they've been fighting it ever since, Russian unconventional war is not winning hearts and minds. It's flattening cities and massacring civilians, as they did in Grozny, Aleppo, and Mariupol. And
Yes.
they're targeting civilians as a form of terrorism, like Al Qaeda. You know, if we deliberately kill civilians, they will demand their government to do a ceasefire. That's
Yes.
not conventional warfare. Deliberately targeting civilians is strictly against the laws of armed conflict. And the laws of armed conflict were created to manage conventional war. Other things are not conventional. You know, the Wagner Group, a mercenary army, the most effective Russian fighting unit until their demise. That's a mercenary army. That's not conventional at all. And both sides are using disinformation, which is not conventional warfare either. I mean, Russia is a disinformation superpower. Yes, we understand that. But so is Ukraine. I mean, we all remember Snake Island when these Ukrainian soldiers on this island in the Black Sea were flipping the middle finger to the Russian Moskva, their capital warship. And of course the Moskva destroyed that squad. Well, and they made them to martyrs. Ukraine made them to martyrs, had postage stamps about them. They used this to rally support and money from NATO. And it turns out that was a complete information op. Those soldiers were fine. It was totally staged. And so the role of disinformation is becoming pivotal for all sides in ways that conventional warriors would not get. So one of the problems is that we're stuck in a conventional war paradigm, and we keep on looking at this war of Ukraine as a conventional war when really it's not very conventional. And the most successful bits and pieces of it are unconventional.
Interesting. Yeah, uh, actually the fake news, the disinformation, this points are very crucial, I believe. I recently had one episode actually with one of the experts who is associated with French foreign affairs, and he even mentioned the similar thing. It's a huge, I would say, uh, threat than anything else. I mean, you don't really have to drop a missile to
Yeah,
scatter, the public and create a havoc in some part of the world, or in some part of the state. One disinformation can actually take everything down in just few
right.
days.
And the reason why is that for the last 30 years, we've increasingly lived in an information age. And barring
Yes.
accidental nuclear warfare, we will continue to live in an information age. And in an
Yes.
information age, it changes geopolitics and it changes warfare. We are
Yes.
still stuck fighting like World War II, 1940s era war, which was not an information age. That's when firepower was the most decisive form of warfare. Today, information at, at the tactical level of war, the operational level of war, and the strategic level of war, that's what's determinative. And it allows weaker military powers to beat strong military powers if they know how to wield disinformation. And in fact, if you look at Zelensky, president of Ukraine, who's a former actor, he and his administration know how to wield a good meme. And that has been very costly for Russia, especially in the first 12 months of that war. So as long as we're stuck in this World War II paradigm, we're never going to learn how to win. And that's the problem I think that people have with Ukraine. Where Ukraine and the US and NATO are stuck in a way of warfare that is obsolete.
Yes. And just to, take a step ahead, how might technological advancement reshape the dynamics of military alliances in the future?
Well, I think technology has a huge impact of war, especially in the world of information. But it's also a challenge. I mean, we could talk about, how NATO can rely on, say, the F-35 fighter jet as its common platform
Yes.
for air to air. But of course, when was the last time there was a strategic air fight in the world, right? I mean, our fighter
Yes.
jets even are they too obsolete? I mean, you've got cheap drones doing it, fighter jets, and fighter jets are not really determinative in the Ukraine war. Um, so why are we focusing on what a fighter jet can do? I mean, the U.S. has been at war someplace for the last 20 years. The F-35 has zero combat missions, right? Zero.
Yes.
So why it's not deterring anybody like nuclear weapons. So what's the point of spending $1.7 trillion on a fighter jet that doesn't go to war? And $1.7 trillion, which is the cost of the program, that's more than Russia's GDP. It's silliness. So I think technology, and so I think that technology has an important role, but it can also be an adverse role. Because I think we're pointing to the wrong North Star in NATO. But I do think that NATO does have to think about hard questions that involve technology. NATO is a democratic alliance of democracies. Now, democracies are very vulnerable to disinformation because
Yes.
we know Russia tries to sway elections throughout NATO countries, and we don't
Yes.
know how successful they are, but we do know they try hard. And how does a democracy fight disinformation without becoming an autocracy in the process? How does a democracy fight disinformation without censorship, without, all these things that democracy depends on? And that's why Russia and China and others use disinformation today. So the question is, what kind of technologies do we need as a democracy to fight disinformation? So who cares about
Yes.
air-to-air missiles and air-to-air combat when we have a strategic problem of autocracies, trying to infiltrate democracies with disinformation, to try to swing close elections, to try to undermine trust of political institutions? No, that's a strategic way to win. Because the strategic logic is this of Russia.
Yes.
Who cares about the sword if you can manipulate the mind that wields it? And that's what disinformation does.
Yes.
So I think technologies have an important role to play in alliance cohesion and alliance structure. But currently, NATO is fighting a 20th century, they're using 20th century models for a 21st century problem.
Yeah. I believe you have already covered most of the part that I was going to actually ask you in the further in the conversation, but yeah, just to little bit backtrack and also touch up on the cyber warfare because we discussed about technological advancement. So as we navigate the era of cyber warfare as well, because I think the disinformation, all these things are a part of somewhere cyber warfare as well because everything works through the networks. So how should military alliances or even an individual military organization collaborate with any other allied nations to enhance the digital security in terms of countering threats, especially?
Well, cyber warfare is an interesting topic because, first of all, it can mean many things to many different people. And while everybody acknowledges cyber warfare as a critical element of future warfare and future statecraft, not everybody agrees even on the basic definition of what cyber is. And one problem is that 25 years ago, the United States, for example, started to conflate cyber with information, right? And that's not necessarily true. I mean, if you look at media studies, information uses many different channels. Channels is like a vector of information. It can be radio, it can be podcast, it can be, letter mail, it can be anything on the internet. It can be cable TV. Those are all different channels for information, for communication. And cyber is an information age is the fastest and, are ultimately probably the best channel. So it gets used that way. But that doesn't make an email a cyber weapon. It doesn't make a podcast a cyber weapon. It's part of a larger malign information campaign. Now, other people also use cyber and digital to do sabotage. So information, I mean, cyber has two big components in warfare. One is disinformation, and the second is in sabotage. So think of how the U.S. think of like Stuxnet in 2010 or 11, where the US and Israel put a virus into Iran's nuclear reactor program to dismantle it. and it had a
Yes.
limited effect. So some people think that that's the forte of cyber, but I've been saying it's never been a forte of cyber. The real forte of cyber has been disinformation, and you don't have to look far. I
Yes.
mean, look, I mean, where we expected Russia to cyber crush Ukraine in early 2022, it had zero impact, no cyber anything. It did not impact the war. Even the 2000, even the Stuxnet had just a temporary impact that was, you know, basically, Iran just bought some new centrifuges and updated their software, and that was it. So which led to the Iran, nuclear deal. So I think that the true power of cyber is in information and for NATO, it's also operational security. But the problem of cyber is it's not just a military function alone. It requires a whole of government approach, and it requires public-private partnerships because some of the most impressive cyber capabilities are not in the public sector, in the private sector. So, this is a challenge for NATO countries. I mean, how do you get otherwise, we're seeing today is you have cyber mercenaries, right? People who work for the NSA in the United States now work for the UAE, or you have hackback companies. And there's all sorts of weird things that are going on in the cyber world. So we can't think of cyber as just sort of like conventional warfare in cyberspace. We really don't really have good cyber strategists yet after 25 years of discussing
Yes.
this. And we need some thinking about this. And those cyber strategists may not come from the military world. They may come from elsewhere.
Yes. And one of the interesting point you mentioned was about Stuxnet. I actually closely observed the case of Stuxnet, and when we see the patch of 10 years, I think it was deployed in 2010, and it's more than a decade now, almost 13 years. If we look at Iran then, and if we look at the Iran now, it's not only nuclear. It doesn't only have the nuclear capabilities at some levels, but it is also capable to launch the satellites in space too,
Yeah,
which means it has the ballistic missile capabilities too. So
yeah.
with that respect, we have seen somewhere, that program might have backfired. It was sent as a curse, but it came as a blessing for Iran somewhere. I mean, when you push something, some adversaries too hard, they start developing capabilities. I think that's what I have seen happening with Iran, because there have been several, I think, back channel talks that have been going on. Several of the Eastern European nations are also interested to buy drones from them, but of course, because of the sanctions and their NATO membership, they cannot do that. But that's the level of efficiency I think they have achieved in their engineering of the drones as well. So, from that perspective, and there has been, I think, the alliance or the collaborations going on between Iran, North Korea, and Russia. It's still, not evident on what level or how strong it is. So, from that perspective, are there any emerging global trends that could reshape the landscape of military alliances in the coming decades?
Um, yes, I think that the question of military alliances in the coming decade is front and center for the United States of America, for the government here. And it also depending on the political party, because President Biden, who's a Democrat, wants stronger military alliances around the world. He thinks that alliances and collective security agreements are the answer to contain, China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and to some extent, terrorism, which hasn't gone away as we've seen in Gaza Strip today. Meanwhile, if a lot of Republicans and Donald Trump want an isolationist policy where they cut all ties, they want to like no more NATO, no more South Korea, America for American needs. And so there's this, big debate as we speak on the Hill right now. Like President Zelensky this week is in Washington, D.C., trying to get more support, more money, more material for Ukraine. And the Republicans are saying, no, we're tired of giving money to other people's failing wars. whether it be Ukraine or Israel or Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan. And American taxpayers, I think, have a claim here. Like, why are we giving, trillions of dollars ultimately in the last 20 years to nations who cannot defend themselves when we have needs here at home? So there is this existential question, not for the US, but also I think also for global security order of the US in or out. And so, and there's a, and I think there's all sorts of perceptions or misperceptions. Americans believe that most of these agreements, whether it be NATO or Iraq or that NATO are a bunch of free riders. They don't do their share. We do most of the heavy work and stuff like that. And Americans are tired of dying, going abroad, trying to die for other people's wars, which raises the
Yes.
question of Russia invades the Baltics, for example. Is
Yes.
United States of America really going to go to war and risk nuclear warfare with Russia over 6 million people in Latvia, which they don't know anything? They can't even find it in a map. And I think that's a reasonable question. And I think that, American political leaders need to make a case to Americans why that needs to be the way it is. And I don't think the Biden administration has fully made that case, where it wouldn't be hard for Trump to make that case. So I think that in my opinion, military alliances are essential. But it's also to the point where I think you look at the Asia Pacific region, countries there don't really welcome China, but they don't see America as a reliable partner, which is sort of driving them into China's bosom to some extent. I mean, Vietnam, Korea, and Japan do not want to work with China, but they feel they may have no choice if America is not dependable. They feel like there's two trains leaving the station. You have to get on one train now. One's going to Washington, one's going to Beijing, but the Washington train might break down. So what are you going to do? So I think this whole question of alliances is actually top of mind for international relations today.